this short video is really just to show you and explain to you about the different airways that people who are ventilated can have. So this is an endotracheal tube. This is the end that's attached to the ventilator, and this is the end that's inserted into the patient's trachea. Okay, it sits in the airway, and this balloon at the end is inflated in order to secure it within the body. So if I just try and inflate that, maybe you can see that the little balloon has gone up. Right, now what is happening there is reflected by what is happening here, and this lies outside of the person. So you've got a very good idea of how inflated that is by how inflated that little balloon is. The thing is, what we don't want is the balloon to be too down, otherwise we will have a large air leak around that securing balloon, and it will mean that the person is not so well ventilated. It depends on the state of the patient. Sometimes we put these down in order that they can wean and begin to do some of the work of breathing for themselves. But when somebody is fully ventilated, that should be nice and sealed. So what happens in theatre or in an ITU situation, in order to put that tube into somebody, you use something called a laryngoscope, and this is one, and you can see here that there's a little light at the end. So what I need to do is have the head extended, so I might just remove that pillow. Normally he'd be a little bit flatter, but actually for the purposes of this, so that you can see what I'm doing, I've raised him a little. So this goes into the mouth and depresses the tongue. It goes right back, and actually because it's, and the head, with the head right back, and as I lift like that, I can actually see Mettiman's larynx. So the anaesthetist, this is not something that physiotherapists would do, I'm just showing you what the anaesthetists would do. So they would flatten the tongue and open up the larynx, and this person would not be awake right now. They would be anaesthetised and unaware of what was happening. So we then use the light to see the trachea and be able to just slide that in. This is why sometimes people wake up from theatre with a rather sore throat, and it's sometimes because of some of the trauma perhaps of trying to push that tube in. I'm not actually managing terribly well at the minute, but I'm just going to leave it there. Okay, so once that's inserted, I'll then secure it, fixing it within the trachea. So it's gone through the larynx and into the main airway, the trachea, and it's secured there because I have now inflated the balloon. That is now relatively secure. This would then be attached to a ventilator through a connection tubing. That would go to the ventilator, and air would then be pushed into the lungs through this tubing. And you can see that by having that balloon nice and tightly sealed, then that person's breathing, the amount of air, how quickly that air, what pressure that air gets to, is all controlled by the ventilator that will be at the side. So I'm just going to let that down and take it out, because there's another way of being ventilated. Because sometimes when people have been on a ventilator for a little while, and actually it's going to take a little while for them to come off that ventilation, then what they do is a tracheostomy. And I might just sit Mettiman up a little bit. I'll just slide that out. There we go. Okay, and that's very much how you do remove somebody's endotracheal tube. Take down the cuff and slide it out. I'm just going to sit him up a little bit more so that you can see me work his tracheostomy. So that's in there. Sometimes in theatre, rather than having a full ET tube, what you do is you slide this, using a laryngoscope, you slide this. This is a laryngeal mask. That just sits in the large airway over the larynx, so it doesn't go all the way into the trachea. And this is a way in which you can ventilate people or support their ventilation relatively lightly. So somebody who's having relatively minor surgery, who you don't want to knock out, sedate too much, you might use one of these, a laryngeal mask. But now we're thinking about a tracheostomy. So what we do for this is a hole is made in the throat, and actually Metiman's got this amazing little hole already here. You can imagine that this is the cricoid cartilage, and here is my trachea. So what they do is they make a hole in the skin and then just slide this through the skin and through between the cartilage to go down and into the airways. All right, so this is a tracheostomy. This is what they look like. And they just sit on the surface of the skin. Exactly the same securing mechanism takes place so that you can fill this with air and it keeps it nice and steady within the main airway. And so what you also have is some tape that comes around and secures it, because you don't want it to pop out. The skin will it won't leave a hole like there is in Metiman. It will just kind of seal over and then be a little bit awkward if that person needs some support to breathe. You can attach them to a ventilator in exactly the same way. But unlike an endotracheal tube, which is very, very irritating, and it's difficult for people to be comfortable with an ET tube in, excuse me, Metiman, with a tracheostomy, you can wake people up, and so that they can be involved in weaning. And so for somebody who's been on a ventilator for a long time, somebody who's very weak, somebody who's struggling to wake up for whatever reason, then a tracheostomy might be a better option. Because you're out of the mouth and below the larynx, then your cough reflex is much less actually at this point. And so the irritation that's caused by this sitting in that large airway is much less. And so you can wake up and you can be aware, and you can't speak because this is below the level of the larynx, and that little air balloon means that there is no air travelling over the larynx in order for it to work. So people can be awake and aware, but they might not be able to speak. In order to speak, you might need to let that down so the air can travel up over the larynx. You need to perhaps revise some of that airway anatomy that we did in the first year. So you've got your mouth and your pharynx and your oropharynx, and then there is the larynx and then the trachea. And just thinking about where these things are in relation to each other will help you understand why somebody with a tracheostomy can't speak. The other thing that it also is very difficult to do, because you're tethering, this tends to hold down the whole of the upper airway, including the larynx, which means that swallowing, where you get a rising of the larynx, is rather more difficult, and so swallowing becomes very difficult in this with these inserted. So there is a way of checking the pressure in the balloon that's securing things, and that's using this. You can see here in the dial that there is a green bit but also a red bit. So if I insert this, you can see that it's not actually raised at all. But if I pump it up a little bit, you can see that we're now on the green, just about. But if I pump it up too much, it might go into the red. Now what's happened there is the balloon is pressing on the mucosa of the trachea, and that can cause some problems. It can cause a pressure sore, if you like, for the airway, and that's not good. So we would need to reduce some of that pressure. So that's just to show you how we check the safety levels of air pressure within the tracheal balloon. It's very easy to suction when people have got either an endotracheal or a tracheostomy tube. All you do is you unhook and suction. If you're doing open suctioning, obviously with closed, then it becomes part of the circuit, and that is available in another video. All right, thank you.